Have you ever carried a hurt so deep that you quietly decided never to let anyone close again? Jonathan Caldwell did for a decade. He lived behind careful boundaries, convinced it was safer to be alone than to risk being hurt twice. Then, one rainy morning, a simple act of kindness from his new assistant began to soften walls he thought would stand forever. If you were in his place, torn between protecting your heart or giving love another chance, how would you choose? This is a tender story of second chances, trust slowly rebuilt, and the beauty of finding someone who sees you, flaws and all. If you find this story touching, comment 1. If you think this video needs improvement, comment 2. Let's begin the journey of Jonathan and Emily. The lobby of the Plaza Hotel glowed under the warm light of crystal chandeliers. Beyond the polished marble floors and gilded pillars, a ballroom had been transformed into a press center. Rows of chairs lined up facing a stage, draped in the Caldwell Industries logo. Outside, the December air bit at the cheeks of reporters streaming in, clutching press badges and camera equipment. Jonathan Caldwell had agreed to this press conference only because it was necessary. The acquisition his company had just finalized was one of the largest in the industry's history, $5.2 billion. Investors demanded answers, reporters wanted photographs, and, in a city like New York, showing up was as much a part of the job as closing the deal. At 38, Jonathan was known for 3 things: his sharp business instincts, his precise, almost military schedule, and one peculiarity that had sparked endless speculation over the years. He hadn't touched a woman in a decade. Not a handshake, not a friendly pat on the shoulder, nothing. Those who worked closely with him called it the rule. Those who didn't turned it into gossip. This morning, Emily Carter heard the whispers for the first time. She'd been in her new role as his assistant for less than a week, barely enough time to learn the coffee preferences of the executives, let alone the personal boundaries of the man she now worked for. She had arrived early to help the communications team set up. Her long brown hair pulled into a neat ponytail, the sleeves of her navy blouse rolled to her elbows. She moved with the ease of someone who had learned to adapt quickly, years of coordinating charity events in her hometown of Burlington. Vermont had taught her that much, but the plaza was no church basement fundraiser. The energy here was sharper, the pace faster. Linda Park, the head of communications, was adjusting the seating chart when she spotted Emily. "You might want to stay clear of the stage until Jonathan's ready," she said in a half-whisper. Emily smiled politely. Noted. But the warning didn't make much sense until it happened. One of the sound technicians hurried toward Linda, looking flustered. The clip on Mr. Caldwell's mic just broke. He muttered, "We'll have to attach it directly to his shirt collar," and he trailed off, glancing toward the tall figure by the side of the stage. Jonathan stood there in his tailored charcoal suit, reviewing note cards, the morning light from the tall windows catching in his steel blue eyes. He was the picture of composure, the kind of man who looked like he'd been born wearing cufflinks. "No one's going to do it?" Emily asked, looking between them. The technician shifted uncomfortably. "We can't exactly." "I'll handle it," Emily said before she could think twice. She crossed the few steps to Jonathan, aware of the weight of a dozen curious eyes on her. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, keeping her tone calm. "Your mic clip broke. I just need to fasten this to your collar." He glanced at the small device in her hand, then at her face. There was a flicker of hesitation in his gaze, as if weighing the risk of letting her near, but he didn't speak. Emily stepped closer, careful and quick, sliding the microphone over the crisp white collar of his shirt. Her fingertips brushed the skin just below his jaw, warm, steady, unremarkable in the way any human touch should be. But the reaction was anything but ordinary. Jonathan's shoulders stiffened, his eyes darkened, and in a low voice, almost too quiet for anyone else to hear, he said, "Don't ever touch me again." The words were not loud, but they carried the chill of a slammed door. Emily froze, the small clip still between her fingers. She stepped back slowly, her own heartbeat a little too loud in her ears. From the corner of her vision, she saw Linda's expression tighten, and a few members of the team exchange knowing glances. The air seemed to shift, the kind of awkward silence that settled when something personal had just been exposed in public. Jonathan adjusted his tie, smoothed the front of his jacket, and walked toward the podium without another word. Emily stood there for a moment, the tiny microphone case in her hand, wondering what on earth she'd done wrong. She wasn't the type to fluster easily. Years of working with difficult personalities had taught her how to let sharp comments roll off her back, but this felt different. It wasn't annoyance she'd seen in his eyes. It was something else, something closer to fear. And fear, she knew, always had a story behind it. The press conference began, the clicking of camera shutters filling the room as Jonathan spoke with his usual measured confidence, but Emily barely heard the words. She was too aware of the way he avoided even glancing in her direction, as if a single look might undo the distance he had just so clearly drawn. When the last question was answered and the reporters began to file out, she turned toward Linda, ready to ask the question that had been building in her mind. But before she could speak, Linda gave a small shake of her head, her voice quiet but firm. "Not here. Not now." Emily closed her mouth. Whatever the story was, it could wait. For now. Still, as she packed away her notes and gathered the stray water bottles from the side table, she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head, the way he had looked at her, the sudden shift in the air between them. It was as if that brief touch had been far more than just an accident. And though she didn't know it yet, it was the first crack in a wall Jonathan Caldwell had spent 10 years building, one Emily was about to find herself standing on the other side of. The next morning, the glass facade of Caldwell Industries caught the early light, throwing it across the busy street like a sheet of gold. Inside, the lobby hummed with quiet efficiency, security scanning badges, the soft whir of elevators, the occasional echo of heels on marble. Emily stepped through the revolving doors, clutching her coffee in one hand and a folder of schedules in the other. Her mind, however, was still circling back to yesterday morning at the plaza. That brief moment, his voice low, the words sharp, the way the air seemed to change had lodged itself in her thoughts overnight. She'd lain awake in her small apartment in the Upper West Side, telling herself not to overthink it. People had their quirks. But quirks didn't come wrapped in the kind of look Jonathan Caldwell had given her. As she crossed the open-plan floor toward her new desk, she caught the flicker of glances, not hostile, but watchful. It didn't take long before Linda Park appeared at her side, carrying a stack of press clippings. "You survived your first event," Linda said, her tone casual, but her eyes searching. Emily set down her coffee. "That makes it sound like I wasn't supposed to." Linda hesitated, then leaned in just enough so her voice wouldn't carry. "People talk here. They always have. And most of what they say about Jonathan isn't worth repeating. Except for one thing." Emily kept her expression neutral. "And that is, he doesn't let women touch him. Not even by accident. Hasn't for 10 years. Emily almost smiled. "That sounds exaggerated." Linda's brows rose. "You think yesterday was normal." Emily thought of the way his shoulders had locked, the slight tremor in his jaw. "I think I don't know the whole story." Linda gave a small shrug, as if to say you won't, and moved on toward her office. The morning unfolded in the usual blur emails, meeting reminders, arranging travel. Jonathan's instructions came through precisely worded messages, each signed off with nothing more than J.C. He passed her desk once, speaking only to ask for a report on the West Coast merger. His eyes didn't linger. And yet, she noticed, his pace slowed ever so slightly as he walked away. Around noon, she headed down to the cafe on the ground floor. The line was long, filled with employees escaping their screens for a moment of caffeine and quiet. Behind her, two analysts from the finance department chatted in hushed tones. "I heard she didn't know," one said. "How could she? HR never tells the new ones." Emily pretended not to hear, but the words slipped under her skin. Whatever this rule was, it wasn't just an office quirk, it was something people tiptoed around, something unspoken yet understood by everyone but her. When she returned upstairs, a delivery cart blocked part of the hallway. She stepped aside, only to find Jonathan approaching from the other end. The space between them narrowed until the delivery cart forced them within arm's reach. For the briefest moment, his gaze locked on hers, steady, unreadable. And then, just as quickly, he stepped back, allowing her to pass first. "Thank you," she murmured. He gave no reply. Back at her desk, she told herself to let it go. She was here to do a job, not to unravel the mysteries of her boss's personal life. But the truth was, she'd always been the kind of person who noticed the little things, the way someone's tone shifted mid-sentence, the pause before an answer, the stories hiding in silences. And in Jonathan Caldwell's silences, there was a whole history. By the end of the day, she had memorized the layout of the 42nd floor, learned the preferred coffee orders of 3 senior executives, and scheduled a week's worth of meetings. She also knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that every single person who worked here had adapted to the rule. They kept their distance. They avoided casual contact. They treated proximity as something earned, not assumed. She was the only one who had broken it, and not just broken it, but done so in front of an audience. As she shut down her computer, she glanced toward Jonathan's office. The glass walls reflected the sunset over Manhattan, but she could still see him inside, standing at his desk. One hand braced against the polished wood, the other holding a pen he wasn't using. His gaze was fixed on something far away, somewhere she couldn't follow. For a fleeting second, he looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from a 12-hour workday, but the kind that settled deep in the bones. She picked up her bag, hesitated, then walked toward the elevator. The questions could wait. The curiosity could wait. But the feeling, the pull of wanting to understand, wasn't going anywhere. By late afternoon, the tempo inside Caldwell Industries had shifted. The constant ping of emails and the clipped pace of hurried footsteps had given way to the softer sounds of drawers closing and muted conversations about dinner plans. Emily stacked a folder of contracts against her hip, their crisp edges pressing through her blouse. She had been assigned to deliver them to the 39th floor, simple enough, though her mind was still circling that moment in the hallway earlier when Jonathan's gaze had flicked over her. Cool, but unreadable. She stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for her floor. The polished steel doors slid together with a quiet sigh. A voice called, "Hold, please," just before they closed completely. A hand appeared, stopping them mid-track. Jonathan stepped in. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing the neat line of his tie, and the subtle looseness at his collar, a small concession to a long day. He stood opposite her, pressing 39. 39, she asked, just to confirm. A single nod. The hum of the elevator filled the silence. Emily shifted the folder in her arms, resisting the urge to fill the quiet with chatter. They were moving steadily upward when, without warning, the elevator shuddered. It was the kind of jolt that sends a ripple through the body before the mind catches up. The lights flickered twice, then dimmed. Emily's pulse picked up. That didn't feel normal. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his voice calm but clipped. Mechanical issue. It happens. He slipped a phone from his jacket, glanced at the screen. No signal. The air felt different in the pause that followed. The faint scent of cedar and coffee from his suit mixed with the sterile tang of elevator metal. Emily leaned lightly against the wall, searching for a neutral topic. "Have you been stuck in one before?" she asked. "Yes." His answer was immediate, without elaboration. "I've been stuck twice," she offered. "Once in my college dorm, took an hour to get out. Once in the Burlington Library, smelled like old books and burnt coffee. Not the worst place to wait, if you're a reader." For just a heartbeat, the corner of his mouth softened. Not a smile exactly, but something close. Then the elevator lurched again. Emily's balance tipped forward, and instinct took over her free hand, shot out, finding the solid line of his forearm. The contact was brief, but her fingertips registered the tension beneath the fine fabric. His muscles locked, and she braced for the recoil, but it didn't come right away. "I'm fine," he said finally, voice lower now. She released her grip, the warmth of his skin lingering faintly against her palm. Her heart was beating a little faster than before, not from fear, but from the fact that, for the first time, he hadn't immediately pulled away. Minutes stretched thin. The panel above them stayed frozen at 28. She risked a glance at him. He was steady, shoulders squared, but his breathing had shifted slower, measured, like he was reining something in. The intercom crackled, startling them both. "We've located the problem. You'll be moving again shortly. Sorry for the delay." The elevator hummed back to life. Neither spoke until the doors slid open on 39. Emily stepped out first, but his voice stopped her before she could turn down the hall. "Carter." She looked back. His eyes met hers with an unusual steadiness. "Thank you for keeping calm." It was a small thing, but from Jonathan Caldwell, it felt like a fracture in stone. Later that evening, Emily left the office through the side entrance, the autumn air cool against her cheeks. She decided to stop by the cafe a block away for a cup of tea before heading home. Through the wide front window, she spotted him. Jonathan seated alone at a corner table. A mug sat untouched before him. Steam long since faded. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't reading anything, just sitting there, eyes distant, as if caught in a memory. The sight made her slow on the sidewalk. She could walk in, maybe make some offhand remark about the elevator, break the tension between them. Instead, she kept walking. The image of him alone in that pool of lamplight staying with her long after she'd turned the corner. Whatever walls he had built around himself, she thought, they weren't unshakable. They had already shifted, if only by an inch. The following morning, Jonathan's office was quieter than usual. The city stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the early sunlight turning the Hudson into a strip of silver. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee Robert Hughes had dropped by earlier, leaving a mug on the desk. Jonathan stood near the window, hands in his pockets, but his mind wasn't on the skyline. It kept circling back to yesterday in the elevator, the warmth of Emily's hand on his arm, the fact that he hadn't recoiled instantly. That was different. He told himself it was nothing, just a lapse. But the thought lingered, threading into places he didn't want it to go. The intercom buzzed. "Robert Hughes here to see you," the receptionist said. "Send him in," Jonathan replied. Robert stepped inside, the lines on his face deepening with a knowing smile. You look like a man with too much on his mind. I'm fine, Jonathan said, moving to his desk. Robert set a folder down. You've been fined for 10 years. John, that's not the same as living. Jonathan glanced up, ready to deflect, but Robert's gaze was steady. You know, seeing that new assistant of yours yesterday, she's not like the others. Others, Jonathan asked, the ones who tried to get close for the wrong reasons. Emily doesn't seem like she's here for anything but the job. Jonathan didn't respond. Robert studied him for a moment longer, then said quietly, You still think about it, don't you, Boston? 10 years ago. The church bells had just finished ringing when Jonathan stepped outside into the cool April air. The reception hall behind him buzzed with music and laughter. His wedding day, the one that was supposed to be the start of forever. He found Megan near the garden terrace, her phone in hand, her eyes flicking toward the man beside her, his best friend, Daniel. It wasn't the closeness that struck him first. It was the look in her eyes. Not love, not even guilt. Something colder. When he confronted her later, alone, she didn't deny it. You were never enough for me. Jonathan, she said, each word clipped, deliberate. Something in him cracked that day, sharp and final. The betrayal was bad enough, but the ease with which she said it, that was what hollowed him out. In the months that followed, he stopped letting anyone close enough to touch him, physically or otherwise. It was cleaner that way, safer. A knock pulled him back to the present. Emily stood in the doorway, a tablet in hand. You asked for the quarterly numbers, she said. He gestured for her to come in. She crossed the room, her steps even, her posture professional. Yet there was a light in her eyes that reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Someone looking at him without calculation. Here, she said, handing him the tablet. Their fingers didn't touch, but the nearness was enough to stir that flicker of unease again. He scanned the figures, nodding. Accurate. Thank you. She hesitated before leaving. If you have a moment later, I'd like to go over the press schedule for next week. Later, he said, more abruptly than intended. She gave a small nod and left. Jonathan set the tablet down and leaned back in his chair. Through the glass wall of his office, he could see her at her desk, talking with Linda. There was an ease to her movements, a groundedness that felt dangerous, because if he wasn't careful, he might start to believe she could be different. That evening, as the office emptied, Jonathan found himself standing in the hallway, watching Emily gather her things. Carter, he called. She looked up. Yes. Mr. Caldwell, tomorrow morning, 8 sharp. We're visiting the Harbor View site. I want you to come along. Her brows lifted slightly. All right. She didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. But as she walked past him toward the elevator, the faint scent of her perfume trailed after her, something light, like citrus and fresh air. Jonathan stayed there a moment longer, wondering if he'd just made a decision he couldn't take back. The morning at Harborview carried a mix of scent salt from the nearby bay, diesel from the work trucks, and the faint tang of freshly cut timber. The old shipping yard, once bustling with cargo ships, now stood in transition. Rusted cranes loomed like relics of another era, while skeletal steel frames stretched upward, ready to hold the weight of something new. Emily stepped out of the black sedan first. Gravel crunched under her low-heeled boots, and a gust of cool air tugged at the ends of her scarf. She pulled her coat tighter, eyes scanning the expanse of the site. Jonathan followed, his gaze moving over the construction as though cataloging every inch, calculating cost, progress, and potential. Watch your step, he said. The words quiet, but instinctive. A man in a hard hat approached Bill Mason, the site manager. He greeted them both, then handed out bright orange safety vests. Jonathan slipped his on without pause. Emily hesitated at the stubborn zipper until she managed to secure it, giving herself a quiet nod of triumph. "This way," Bill said, leading them toward a newly erected building frame. The air was filled with the metallic clink of tools, the distant hum of a generator, and the occasional murmur of workers calling to one another. They climbed a temporary staircase to a viewing platform. From here, the river spread out below, its surface rippling with sunlight. Across the water, the city skyline stood clear against the pale sky. Emily rested her hands on the railing. "It's different from the view in your office," she said. Jonathan glanced sideways at her. "Out here, nothing hides behind glass." For a moment, the wind carried only the sound of gulls circling overhead. She let the quiet linger, feeling the openness in her chest. "I like it. You can actually hear yourself think. That can be a dangerous thing," he replied, though his tone was softer than his words. Bill excused himself to check a delivery, leaving them alone on the platform. Emily turned toward Jonathan. "I didn't realize Harborview had this much character. On paper, it's just figures and deadlines. Numbers don't tell you how the air smells," he said. She smiled faintly. "Or how the wind feels on your face." Their eyes met for a beat too long before the sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled them back. By mid-morning, the walkthrough was complete. Jonathan suggested they stop at a cafe a few blocks away, a brick-front shop with ivy climbing its side, and a sign that read, "The Harbor Nook." Inside, the air was warm and smelled of coffee beans and fresh pastries. A wood stove in the corner gave off a steady crackle. They found a small table by the window overlooking the water. Jonathan ordered a black coffee. Emily chose chamomile tea with honey. "It's quieter here," she said, cupping her hands around the warm mug. "Sometimes quieter is better," he replied. She studied him over the rim of her cup. "Was it always like that for you, preferring quiet?" He traced a finger along the handle of his coffee mug before answering, "No." The pause invited her to ask more, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned back and told him about her hometown, how autumn in Vermont painted the hills in shades of fire, how her mother would leave pies to cool on the windowsill, and how she'd learned to skate on a frozen pond near their house. Jonathan listened, his gaze steady, as if memorizing each image. "You miss it," he said. "Sometimes, but New York has its own rhythm. You just have to decide if it's one you want to dance to." A faint shadow of a smile passed his lips. "And have you?" She tilted her head. "I think so, but I'm still learning the steps." Their drinks lingered half-finished, the conversation drifting between light observations and pockets of comfortable silence. Outside, a fishing boat moved slowly across the water, its wake folding into the current. When they finally stepped back into the crisp air, the wind had picked up, carrying the sharp scent of the sea. Jonathan walked a step behind her to the car. Without a word, he opened her door. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes for a brief moment before sliding in. The drive back was quiet, but not the strained quiet of the elevator 2 days ago. This was different, less guarded, more like the stillness after a storm. Neither of them said it out loud, but something at Harborview had shifted, and it wasn't just the steel and concrete. The chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria shimmered like captured starlight, casting warm golden halos over the marble floors. The annual Caldwell Industries Charity Gala was in full swing, strings played softly from a corner stage, and the air buzzed with the hum of polite laughter and the clink of champagne flutes. Jonathan stood near the entrance, his tuxedo as precise as every other detail about him tonight. He scanned the room, nodding to investors and board members, exchanging the kind of brief, calculated pleasantries he'd mastered over the years, but in truth, his attention was elsewhere. Because he was waiting for her. Emily arrived a few minutes later, stepping through the double doors in a deep emerald gown that caught the light with every movement. Her hair was swept into soft waves over one shoulder, and the understated elegance of her pearl earrings made her look timeless. For a moment, Jonathan forgot to breathe. She smiled when she spotted him, but before she could cross the room, another figure intercepted her. Nathan Cole. Jonathan knew him well enough to know he didn't like him. Nathan was a successful real estate developer with a reputation for charm, too much of it. And right now, all of it was being directed at Emily. Nathan's hand rested lightly at the small of her back as he leaned in to say something. Emily laughed, a soft, genuine sound that Jonathan had only heard a handful of times himself. Something in his chest tightened. Linda Park appeared at Jonathan's side, following his gaze. Nathan's been circling all evening. He's got that collector's instinct. Jonathan's jaw flexed. She's not a thing to collect. Linda gave him a look, but said nothing. Across the room, Emily excused herself from Nathan, heading toward the refreshment table. Jonathan took the opportunity and moved through the crowd with quiet purpose. "You look different tonight," he said when he reached her. "Different good or different bad?" she asked, handing him a glass of champagne. His eyes lingered for a beat too long before he answered, "Good." Before she could respond, Nathan reappeared, this time with 2 glasses of wine. "Emily, you really must join my table. We're discussing the Harborview project. And I'd love your take." Jonathan's voice cut in, calm but edged. "She's here with me." Nathan smiled, all smooth deflection. Of course, just borrowing her for a moment. Emily looked between them, sensing the undercurrent. "I can speak with Nathan for a few minutes," she said lightly. Jonathan said nothing, but the way his hand closed around the stem of his glass made his knuckles pale. Later, when the auction portion of the evening began, Jonathan found himself at a table near the front, half listening to the bidding. From across the room, he could see Emily and Nathan in conversation, her head tilted toward him, that same soft laugh spilling into the space between them. It wasn't jealousy, Jonathan told himself. It was concern for her, about him. But when Nathan leaned in closer, the logic in his mind dissolved into a tight, unwelcome heat. He rose from his seat before he'd decided to, cutting through the rows of tables until he reached them. "Emily, I need a word," he said, his voice lower than the music but firm enough to leave no room for refusal. Her brows lifted in mild surprise. Now. She excused herself from Nathan, following Jonathan toward the side corridor leading to the quieter foyer. "What was that about?" she asked once they were alone. His hands were in his pockets, but his voice carried an edge. "Nathan Cole isn't the kind of man you want to get comfortable with." Her gaze narrowed. "Is this about him, or is it about you?" He met her eyes and found no judgment there, just the steady, unflinching calm that made her so different from anyone else in his life. "Maybe both," he admitted. For a moment, neither spoke. The muffled sounds of the gala drifted through the closed doors. Emily finally broke the silence. "Jonathan, I'm here to work, but that doesn't mean I can't talk to people, even people you don't like." His jaw tightened. "I know. He exhaled, the words slipping out quieter than he intended. "I don't like watching someone else get your attention." Her expression softened, but before she could respond, a staff member appeared at the doorway to tell Jonathan he was needed for the next segment of the evening. As they walked back into the glittering light of the ballroom, the tension between them hadn't broken, It had simply shifted, becoming something neither of them was ready to name. The night air outside the Waldorf Astoria felt sharper than it had when they arrived. The lingering hum of the ballroom was replaced by the muffled sounds of the city car horns from a block away, the low thrum of traffic on Park Avenue, and the faint chatter of guests lingering under the marquee. Emily stepped out beneath the golden light spilling from the entrance, pulling her shawl tighter against the cool air. She paused at the top of the steps, scanning the valet line. Jonathan was already there, speaking in low tones to an attendant. Even in the understated black of his tuxedo, there was an ease in the way he held himself controlled, measured, as if no part of him was ever left to chance. When their eyes met, he gestured toward the sedan waiting at the curb. "Get in," he said, his voice carrying more softness than command. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping toward him. He opened the rear door, and she slid into the leather-scented quiet of the car. The city began to slip past them in a blur of neon and street lamps. For a while, neither spoke. Emily kept her gaze on the window, watching the reflections of passing headlights glide across the glass. Jonathan's hand stayed steady on the wheel, his profile etched in the soft glow from the dashboard. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said finally. Her lips curved slightly. "Even with Nathan, especially with Nathan." His tone was flat, but there was something behind it, something she couldn't quite name. Emily gave a small, knowing smile. "I wasn't trying to win anyone over. I was making conversation." Jonathan's grip on the wheel eased, though his eyes stayed on the road. "It's not you I don't trust." She tilted her head toward him. Then he was quiet for a moment, as if weighing how much to give away. Men like him, they treat charm like currency, and they spend it carelessly without thinking about the cost to other people. The truth in his tone made her pause. "That sounds like experience talking." His eyes flicked to hers for a second before returning to the road. "It is." They stopped at a red light. The glow washed over his face, softening the edges. Outside, a taxi crawled past, music leaking from its half-open window. Somewhere farther away, a siren wailed, then faded. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "I can take care of myself. I know you can." His voice was lower now, more measured. "I just didn't like the way he looked at you." She searched his face in the dim light, but he didn't look back. "That's not exactly professional," she teased lightly, though her tone was more curious than mocking. "No," he admitted. The rest of the drive unfolded in a delicate kind of silence, not heavy like the one in the elevator days ago, but charged, as though both of them were aware of something that had shifted, but neither was ready to name it. When they pulled up in front of her building, Jonathan put the car in park. Emily unfastened her seatbelt but didn't reach for the door handle right away. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice carrying a trace of something unspoken. "Emily." He stopped, his jaw tightening briefly, before relaxing again. "Good night." She waited a heartbeat, as if expecting more, but when nothing came, she nodded and stepped out into the cool night. Jonathan watched as she walked toward the entrance, her gown swaying with each step. When the lobby doors closed behind her, he stayed there for a moment, his fingers still curled loosely around the steering wheel. The city moved on around him, horns, engines, and laughter from the sidewalk, but he barely heard it. Somewhere between the glare of the chandeliers and the quiet of this street, something in him had shifted again, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he wanted to shift back. Jonathan woke before his alarm, the gray light of early dawn spilling faintly through the half-open blinds. Sleep had been shallow. His mind kept circling back to the moment outside Emily's building, to the words he hadn't said. By habit, he reached for his phone. A new message flashed on the screen from Robert Hughes' change of schedule. Board meeting moved to 8:30. Don't be late. He glanced at the time. It was just past 7 Cerebro. Normally, he would have been at the office already. But this morning, he sat at the edge of his bed for a long moment, elbows resting on his knees, his thoughts restless. At 7:45, he stepped into the lobby of Caldwell Industries. The sharp scent of polished marble and fresh coffee hit him instantly. He expected to see Emily at her desk, as she always was, early, organized, ready. But her chair was empty. Carter not in yet. He asked Linda Park, who was just passing by. Linda paused, shifting a stack of folders in her arms. She called in, said she'd be in after lunch. Didn't sound like herself. Jonathan's brows drew together. Did she say why? No. Just that something came up. Linda kept moving, leaving him in the middle of the hallway with a sudden, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. By noon, his attention to the board meeting had fractured entirely. When the final report wrapped, he didn't return to his office. Instead, he left the building, walking the 2 blocks to a small bakery Emily had once mentioned liking. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. He spotted her almost immediately sitting at a corner table, a paper cup between her hands, her gaze fixed on something outside the window. She didn't notice him at first. "Playing hooky," he said lightly as he approached. She looked up, startled. Then she smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Not exactly. He nodded toward the empty chair across from her. "May I?" She gestured for him to sit. There was a pause before he spoke again. "Linda said you'd be in late." "Everything all right." Emily traced the rim of her cup with her thumb. "Just needed some space this morning." From work. Her gaze lifted to his, steady but unreadable. From certain things at work. Jonathan leaned back slightly, reading between the lines. "Because of Nathan." Her lips quirked, but there was no amusement in it. "Because of the way you acted around Nathan." He didn't deny it. "I overstepped. You were protective," she said carefully. "And I'm not sure if that's coming from you as my boss, or from you as—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Never mind." As what he pressed. She met his eyes again. "As someone who sees me as more than an assistant." The space between them seemed to shrink, though neither moved. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping against the bakery windows. Emily glanced at it before speaking again. "Jonathan, I like working with you, but I need to know where the lines are. And if you don't know either, that's going to be a problem." Her words were soft, but they landed with precision. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "You're right. I haven't been clear." "Then be clear," she said. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her the way a man might study a horizon he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. "I don't want there to be a line," he said finally. Something flickered in her expression, part surprise, part something else. "Then you have to decide what that means." The rain outside thickened, blurring the world beyond the glass. For a moment, it felt like the two of them were in a pocket of time, suspended between choices. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "If I decide I don't want to go back." "Then don't," she said simply. It was the kind of exchange that left more unsaid than spoken, but as they sat there, the air between them felt changed. By the time they returned to the office, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under a break in the clouds. Emily walked ahead toward her desk, and Jonathan followed at a measured distance. He didn't need to speak. The decision, though unspoken, had already begun to take root. The storm rolled in faster than the forecast had promised. By the time Jonathan left the office, the streets were slick with rain, neon signs shimmering in distorted pools on the pavement. He hadn't planned to see Emily tonight. In fact, after their conversation at the bakery, he'd told himself to keep a respectful distance to give her the space she'd silently asked for. But as he reached for his coat, he noticed the faint glow from her office. She was still here. Jonathan paused in the doorway, watching her through the glass. She was bent over her desk, the lamplight casting a warm halo over her hair. A stack of reports lay open beside her, but her gaze was somewhere else, entirely fixed on the rain beyond the window. "Working late?" he asked, stepping inside. She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Just trying to finish this before the weekend, and maybe waiting for the rain to ease up." He glanced outside. "Doesn't look like it will anytime soon." She closed the folder, sitting back. "Then I guess I'm stuck." Something in him softened. "Not if you let me drive you home." They left the building together, the lobby lights spilling onto the wet sidewalk. Jonathan held the door of the car for her, the scent of rain already clinging to her coat. Inside, the windows fogged slightly as they pulled into the slow-moving traffic. For the first few blocks, they spoke about ordinary things: the stubborn leak in the 12th floor conference room, the new coffee vendor in the lobby. But when the traffic light turned red near Central Park, Jonathan glanced over and found her watching him. "What?" he asked. "You're different tonight," she said. Quieter. He considered that. Maybe I'm just listening more to what her gaze didn't waver. To yourself. The light turned green, but the words stayed with him as they drove on. When they reached her street, the rain had thickened into a steady curtain. Jonathan pulled up to the curb, but didn't unlock the doors immediately. "Thank you," she said, her voice low in the hush of the storm. "Emily." He hesitated, gripping the wheel as if it might anchor him. "I meant what I said at the bakery, about not wanting a line between us." She searched his face, the rain drumming softly against the roof. "Then you have to stop pretending one is still there." It was such a simple sentence, but it landed with the weight of something irrevocable. Before he could second-guess himself, Jonathan reached for her hand. Not quickly, not cautiously, just enough for their fingers to find each other in the dim light. She didn't pull away. For a moment, the sound of the rain was the only thing between them. Then she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come upstairs." Jonathan didn't move right away. His mind was a quiet storm, memories of betrayal pressing against the present moment, the instinct to retreat clashing with the pull of something he no longer wanted to fight. "I'm not good at this," he admitted. "Neither am I," she said, "but maybe we don't have to be." Something in him gave way then, not with a crash, but with the quiet finality of a door unlocking. He nodded once. When they stepped out into the rain, it was cold and insistent, soaking through the fabric of their coats. She led the way to the building, glancing back only once to be sure he was following, and he was though he had no idea where this night would take them. The rain hadn't let up by the time they reached Emily's apartment. The sound followed them inside, a steady rhythm against the windows. She took his coat and hung it on the rack by the door, the small gesture somehow grounding them both. Jonathan stood in the entryway for a moment, his hands in his pockets, scanning the quiet space. It was warm, lived-in soft lighting, a knitted throw over the couch, a small vase of tulips on the kitchen counter. It felt nothing like the sleek, calculated world he'd built for himself. "Tea?" she asked, moving toward the kitchen. He nodded, following her at a slower pace. She set water to boil, the click of the stove filling the silence between them. "Jonathan," she said finally, without turning around, "if you came up here tonight just to back away again tomorrow, you should tell me now." He exhaled, the truth pressing hard against his ribs. "That's not why I'm here." She faced him then, leaning against the counter. Then, why he stepped closer, the air between them carrying the faint scent of chamomile from the tea tin she'd opened. "Because for 10 years I told myself I didn't need anyone, that I was fine alone. And then you walked in and I wasn't fine anymore." Her eyes softened, but she didn't move toward him. "That's not a reason to be with someone. Jonathan, you can't just need me to fill a space." "I don't," he said. "I want you because you make me different, not softer, not weaker, just more me." The kettle began to whistle, sharp against the quiet. She turned away to pour the water, her hand steady even as her mind raced. They sat on the couch, mugs warming their palms. Outside, the storm rumbled, a low and distant echo. Jonathan stared into his tea for a long moment before speaking again. "I told you once that I don't trust easily." "I never told you why." Emily didn't rush him. He told her about Megan, about Daniel, about the words that had burned into him and shaped every wall he'd built since. "You were never enough," he repeated softly, as if saying them again might strip them of their power. Emily set her mug down, leaning forward. "Jonathan," that was her truth, not the truth. "You've been living as if those words were a fact, but they were just cruelty." He met her gaze, and for the first time he let her see the wound without the armor. The knock on the door came suddenly, breaking the moment. Emily rose, surprised it was late. She opened the door to find Linda Park, holding a manila envelope, rain dripping from her umbrella. "Sorry for the intrusion," Linda said, "but this couldn't wait until morning." Jonathan stood, frowning. "What is it?" Linda handed him the envelope. "Nathan Cole has been trying to buy into Harborview through a third party. I thought you should see the documents before it's too late." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages: purchase offers, shell companies, backdated agreements. He's been playing both sides. He muttered. Emily watched him, recognizing the shift in his posture. "What will you do?" He looked up, and for a moment, the old Jonathan, the man who saw people only as threats or assets, was there. But then he glanced at her, and something steadied. "I'll shut him down, but I won't do it the way I used to." The next morning, Jonathan walked into Caldwell Industries with Emily by his side. Robert was waiting in his office, already aware of the situation. "I can bury him in litigation," Robert said. "He'll fold." Jonathan shook his head. "No, we'll call him in, lay out what we know, and give him one option: walk away clean. If he refuses, then we let the law handle it. No backroom deals. No mud." Robert raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. An hour later, Nathan sat across from Jonathan in the conference room, his charm stripped bare. Jonathan laid the documents on the table, speaking in a voice so calm it cut deeper than anger. "You have until end of day to withdraw all offers and walk away. If you don't, the city will see exactly what you've been doing." Nathan tried to smile. "And if I do, you'll forget this ever happened." "I'll forget you," Jonathan said simply. Nathan left without shaking his hand. When the door closed, Jonathan turned to Emily. "It's done." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "And what about us?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the storm the night before. Jonathan stepped closer. "Emily, I can't promise I won't mess this up sometimes, but I can promise I won't run anymore. Not from you, not from what this is. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she reached for his hand the same way she had in the elevator all those weeks ago. The touch that had started everything. Then we're even, she said softly, because I'm not running either. Months later, Harborview opened its first completed building. The air at the ribbon cutting was crisp with the first hints of spring. Jonathan stood with Emily at his side as the press snapped photos. Robert gave a brief speech. Linda fielded questions. And, for once, Jonathan didn't mind the attention. When the ceremony ended, they walked to the waterfront, away from the crowd. The water was calm, the sky pale and wide above them. "You know," Emily said, "if someone told me last year I'd be here with you, I wouldn't have believed them." He glanced at her. "If someone told me I'd let anyone this close again, I wouldn't have believed them either." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the gulls calling overhead. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "You were right, Emily. Those words, 'you were never enough,' they weren't the truth. This feels like the truth." She smiled, sliding her hand into his. "And what is the truth, Jonathan?" "That I was just waiting for the right person to prove me wrong." They stayed there until the wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of summer. Whatever storms had come before, they were gone now, leaving only what remained, something steady, something real, something worth keeping. It was a mild spring afternoon, the kind that seemed to hold its breath in quiet anticipation. The gardens of the Harborview Pavilion, now fully completed, were dressed in soft whites and greens. Rows of folding chairs faced an arch wrapped in fresh tulips and ivy. The bay shimmered beyond, sunlight glancing off the water like scattered coins. Jonathan stood near the arch, adjusting his cufflinks for the third time. Robert chuckled quietly beside him. "Relax, Caldwell. You've closed billion-dollar deals with less fuss." "This isn't a deal," Jonathan said, his voice low but steady. "This matters more." Guests milled about, chatting softly. Linda Park was near the front row, wearing a pale lavender dress and a knowing smile. Even some of the Harborview construction crew had been invited faces that had become part of the journey. The music began, a gentle string melody that carried over the water. Everyone rose. Emily appeared at the end of the aisle, her arm linked with her father's. Her gown was simple, satin that moved like liquid with each step. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of white tulips, a quiet nod to the flowers Jonathan had once noticed on her kitchen counter. Jonathan felt the air shift as she walked toward him. The noise of the crowd blurred. There was only her. When she reached him, her father kissed her cheek and placed her hand into Jonathan's. Their fingers fit together with the easy certainty of something long decided. The officiant spoke of commitment, trust, and the kind of love that grows through choice as much as through chance. Then it was time for their vows. Jonathan went first. He didn't look at his notes. "Emily, before you, I lived in walls I'd built myself. They kept me safe, but they also kept me from living. You didn't try to tear them down. You just stood at the gate until I opened it. I vow to never close it again." Emily's eyes glistened. When it was her turn, she spoke with the warmth that had first unsettled him and then saved him. "Jonathan, you once told me you weren't good at this, but you are because you choose to be here. I vow to remind you, on the hard days, that you are more than enough." The words hung in the air, both a promise and a quiet undoing of the wound that had once defined him. They exchanged rings, the gold warm from their hands. "By the power vested in me," the officiant said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He pulled her close, kissing her with the certainty of a man who had stopped running. The guests applauded. Robert whistled, and Linda dabbed discreetly at her eyes. The reception was held in the Harborview Hall, light pouring through the tall windows. There was laughter, clinking glasses, and the easy hum of people gathered for joy. Robert gave a toast that started with a joke about Jonathan's legendary patience and ended with, "Emily, thank you for proving us all wrong about him." Later, Jonathan and Emily stepped outside for a moment alone. The sun was dipping low, turning the bay to molten gold. "You know," Emily said, "I think Harborview was always going to be more than just a project." Jonathan smiled. "It was the place where I learned the difference between building something and keeping it standing." They stood together in the fading light, the sounds of the celebration drifting from inside. Somewhere in that quiet, Jonathan realized the truth. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer held the power to define him. As the first stars appeared, they returned to their guests, hand in hand. There would be more days, good ones, hard ones, but tonight was enough. The walls were down, the doors were open, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Caldwell felt entirely at home. In life, we often build walls to protect ourselves from pain. Sometimes, those walls stand for years, keeping out not only hurt, but also the very connections that could heal us. Jonathan's journey reminds us that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt not overnight, but through patience, honesty, and the courage to stay when it's easier to walk away. Emily didn't try to fix him. Instead, she showed up with steady kindness, letting him decide when to open the door. For those of us who have known loss or betrayal, this story is a gentle reminder the past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. Letting someone in is a risk, but it's also the path to deeper joy. Relationships worth keeping are not built on perfection, but on the choice to face each other on the good days and the hard ones and keep building together. No matter our age, it's never too late to let go of the old fears, to step out from behind the walls, and to choose love that feels steady, honest, and real. Sometimes, healing begins not with grand gestures, but with the quiet decision to stop running. Thank you for spending your time with us and joining this journey. If this story touched your heart or gave you something to think about, we'd be so grateful if you could give it a like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life and keeps this community growing. Let's keep inspiring each other one story at a time.